Welcome all of you to Mayor Eric Filseth's State of the City Address for 2019. If we could all take our seats. Up here we have seats for former council members and mayors. First of all, I'd like all of us here tonight to please recognize all of our city staff, the clerk's office, and the city manager for putting together this great event. Thank you all so much. So it's great to see so many Palo Altans here tonight in this wonderful city library. I'm glad all of you are here. Please enjoy the food from many of Palo Alto's vendors and restaurants. And later on, we will hear from the mayor himself as he has a nice speech and I believe some slides prepared. First of all, we do want to acknowledge the elected officials and appointed board members. So if I call your name, please stand up and be recognized. Joe, before you sit, County Supervisor Joe Simidian. Representing State Senator Jerry Hill, we have Lisa Chung. And representing Assemblymember Mark Berman is Zach Ross. We have a number of former mayors in attendance: Greg Scharf, Pat Burt, Peter Dreckmeyer, Larry Klein, and Karen Holman. We also have a number of council members here: Allison Cormack, Tom DuBois, former Mayor Liz Niss, and council member Lydia Koo. I'd also like to recognize all of the city's boards and commissions who are here tonight. We have members from the Architectural Review Board, members from the Human Relations Commission, Parks and Recreation Commission, the Public Art Commission, the Utilities Advisory Commission, the Historic Resources Board, the Library Advisory Commission, the Planning and Transportation Commission, and the Stormwater Management Oversight Committee. Please join me in thanking them all. I don't believe we have any electeds from Greater Santa Clara County, but if I'm wrong, please correct me. And I did see one of our school board members, Shaunak Darup. Am I missing anyone? Excellent. One last group. We've just recognized all of the current elected officials. These are the folks who serve Palo Alto in the community today. There's one other really important group, which is the future. And so I wish we would please recognize the Palo Alto Youth Council. So thank you all. Now we will have an introduction of Mayor Eric Filseth by our former Mayor Liz Niss. Liz, come on up.
I can turn on my mic.
And I'll turn mine off.
Is that on? These are very tricky gadgets, these, that you fasten on your body somehow. So it is my distinct pleasure tonight, if I can travel with my mic away, to introduce our mayor for this year, Eric Filseth. And I don't want to just talk about him without having him stand up, turn around, so you know exactly who he is. So it's great fun to have Eric as mayor this year. And as you know, we have shrunk this year. We're now down to 7 members rather than our original 9. So the meetings, of course, now end at 8:30 or 9. Isn't that right? Just amazing. Although somebody actually gave you the credit today, Eric. Hard to believe. So let me give you a little background on Eric that you might not know. But tell me, do you also know that if you go to the City Council on our webpage, you can just highlight a name and it gives you their entire CV? Because if not, you might go do it for all the council members if you're interested. So this mayor, this year's mayor, 2019, spent most of his years, school years, in Canada, trudging through the snow, as he said, uphill both ways, to get to school then. And so Canada is very much in his background, and as he said, the healthcare there is, it's the one-payer system. So he said it was pretty good healthcare. So, and when he was a freshman in high school, he served on the student council. That was great preparation for serving on the Palo Alto City Council. And when he was 18, and I'm not quite sure what motivated him, but of his own accord, he decided to go on a TV show, very much like Jeopardy. He tells me he did it all on his own. And he won a weed trimmer and a chainsaw and said they were very handy. And also $100. Am I right, Eric? $100 on top of that. So, and in college, he took his guitar and became part of a group known as Funky Needs. I have no idea where that came from. He might tell you later tonight. But that, I think, was in graduate school. Am I right, Eric? So if you're looking for a good guitar player, apparently this guy from Funky Needs, you know, is your guy. So let me just tell you a little bit about his current background that you may want to know about in his CV. So he went to Stanford and then to UCLA. And I forgot that one of the most important parts of his background is he was a bag boy at Zare's Grocery. Did I pronounce it right? And that's probably what got him to where he is today. Learning how to carry those bags correctly, not drop any of the groceries, and I'll bet everybody, you know, was happy in the end. So he also, in the Valley, has served at National Semiconductor. He was at Cadence a couple of times, I think, and also their corporate VP, and he was the CEO of, I think it's Sarah, help me with the name. Serenova. So this year's mayor comes to you with a very varied background, lots of snow in his background, trudging through it, decides to go on a TV show when he's 18, and is that a weed whacker or a weed trimmer? Pretty much the same thing. And then ends up here in California and ends up as the mayor for our city in 2019. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Mayor Felix, what is your name? Eric, Mayor Eric Filseth. Ta-da! Break a leg.
Thank you very much. The bread on the top of the bag, by the way. So let me see if I can get my glasses here. So thank you very much for everybody coming tonight and for allowing me to speak on our city that we love so much. I do want to thank some people before we get started here. I want to thank all the folks who donated the food, all this great food in the back. And that would be Oren's Hummus over here, St. Michael's Alley, the Annex, Pizza Chicago, Gott's Roadside, Curry Up Now, Koopa Cafe, Tea Run, Spice Kid Asian Street Food, The Prolific Oven, great place, Fleming's Steakhouse and Wine Bar, Tea-Quation, and Taco-licious. So thank you very much for donating the food to this. This is important. I want to thank my colleagues on the council. I want to thank everybody here. I'd like to thank my wife Tina and my son Jared. And so let me get started here. So first and foremost, Palo Alto is a great place to live, raise kids, and grow old. And it's our job in government to keep it that way. Right? I think it's worth saying tonight that also I think it's our responsibility to be a good neighbor. A good neighbor to other cities in the region, the state and the region overall, and actually the rest of the world. And that's kind of how I think about our efforts on climate change and emissions reduction. It's a form of being a good neighbor. Right? According to the annual citizen survey this year, almost all of us continue to believe Palo Alto remains an excellent or good place to live. Things that we really like about Palo Alto: parks, open space, and nature. Public safety, libraries, schools. Not so good things, no surprise, traffic and housing. This year, for the first year, traffic slightly edged housing as the least happy people in town are happy about, but it was pretty close, right? We did a lot of good stuff in the last year to try to keep Palo Alto a great place to live and raise kids and grow old. Oh, and by the way, it's our 125th anniversary this year since our founding in 1894. And if you didn't happen to know that already, you will not be able to forget it, okay, by April, May of this year. Right? So we've done a lot of things in the last year that I think we can be proud of. We've expanded Rinconada Pool's hours, annual hours, at least 50%. We reopened the Baylands Boardwalk. We saved the animal shelter. Pets in Need moved in about 3 weeks ago, and they are open for business now. We opened the Foothills Park, 7.7 acres. We approved approved the new public safety building after all these years. We put through the first city budget in almost 20 years that fully funds its future pensions. Okay? We haven't done that in almost 20 years. No city in California does this. Okay? This year we've done it. We kicked off the Junior Museum and Zoo renovation. We finished the golf course. University Avenue, thank everybody for their patience. Thank you to staff, right? We approved our first affordable housing project in 7 or 8 years about a month ago, Wilton Court. And I do want to say a couple of things about that. So Wilton Court, 58 units, 60% AMI, and developmentally disabled adults. Very hard work by the Palo Alto Housing Corporation and the Ventura neighborhood working together, along with a lot of leadership from my colleague, former Mayor Niss, last year on this. One thing that really helped, $10 million from the city's Affordable Housing Fund. Okay? The big challenge of affordable housing is money. Okay? And you can sort of see why, right? Because the economics of market rate housing are not great, especially compared to office construction right now. Okay? The economics of affordable housing are much more challenging because they don't generate as much rent even as market rate housing. So in order to make the project pencil out, you need more money from someplace. Palo Alto's $10 million went quite a ways. Now Palo Alto's Affordable Housing Fund is now basically empty. Okay? That fund grows $1.5 million to $2 million a year, primarily from impact fees on commercial development, a little bit from market rate development. A couple of years ago, the city did what's called a nexus study to look at what was the relationship between office development and demand for housing. Because if you have office development, you have jobs. Jobs need housing. Some percentage of that needs to be affordable. Okay? So what we found was for each new square foot of office construction in town, created demand for $264 of affordable housing. Okay? Now, our impact fees on affordable housing in town for commercial development are $30 a square foot. And so you might reasonably ask, where does the other $230 million, or $230 million we'll get to later, where does the other $230 a square foot, or $200 or $150 or whatever, where does that come from? And the answer is it doesn't. It comes from waiting over time for this to amass. And so the lesson is, if we want to do more projects like this, okay, we're going to need to find more ways to get more money into the Affordable Housing Fund, at a higher rate than it is now. Now, we've done a bunch of stuff in housing in the last couple of years that is actually kind of interesting. And, I don't really think it was intended this way, but it sort of congealed a little bit into kind of an interesting simulacrum. Okay? So we've taken some action in the last couple of years to accelerate supply growth with the ADU ordinance, which has caused a substantial uptick in ADU production. We passed another housing ordinance a month ago, which is designed to, we've allowed for housing in commercial zones. We've increased densities in FARs and some things like that. At the same time, we acted a couple of years ago to try to attenuate demand growth, primarily by passing office caps, right? And so with the idea that we would reduce job growth, although it sounds crazy, okay, we would reduce job growth in an effort to try to make it easier to keep up with on housing supply. There's something else we did too. This is the infamous VTA lot project, okay? And This is at the corner of Page Mill and El Camino. And the applicant bought it several years ago with the intention of putting an office building there. But in the intervening time, we passed the caps, and the council began indicating that you know, we probably might not look favorably on putting an office building there, but we might look favorably on putting housing there, right? And in fact, after a couple of years of thinking about it, they brought us a housing project, which the council approved, okay? And it has not been built, and so we're waiting on that. But there's an indication, at least, that there's some level of fungibility at some level between space used for commercial development versus for housing development, right? And so we sort of acted to accelerate supply and attenuate demand at the same time to bring, and the result is we're sort of bringing these things into balance. And at the same time, we took some actions to invest in affordable housing to try to get some of this to, more of this to be affordable. Now, in the last few years, we spent like $30 million on affordable housing. We spent $15 million on Buena Vista, $10 million on Wilton Court, and there's 3 left in the Affordable Housing Fund, which is earmarked for Supervisor Simidian's teacher housing project. Okay? And so now we're in a point of wanting to replenish that. Now, if we do this right, we'll be a good neighbor because we won't be dumping demand for housing onto our neighboring cities, okay? And we'll take care of our community. Now, no MBA can get out of bed in the morning without drawing a chart, right? So I wanted to try this one, and I actually think it's kind of interesting, right? You can sort of think about the spectrum of land use as, you know, there are other uses, parks, recreation, open space, stuff, and so forth. But if you just look at development, right, you know, you can have the notion of sort of commercial growth, office R&D in this case, and housing growth. And I think it's pretty clear that everybody knows by now, if you build a large amount of office and R&D growth, and it creates demand for jobs, and you don't build any housing, you're going to make the regional housing shortage worse. Whereas if you develop a lot of housing space and don't put any jobs in place, you're probably going to make the regional housing shortage better, right? And it makes sense to think about somewhere in between, there's a level where they balance, okay? Hard to say exactly where that is, but it's somewhere. And so if you make some assumptions about how many jobs per square feet, you know, sort of conventional assumptions, how many employees per housing unit, you know, somewhere in there, there's a balance. And if you're on this side, you're worsening the region's housing problem. And if you're on this side, you're making it better. Okay? It might be interesting to ask, where is Palo Alto? Okay? Well, like a lot of municipalities, coming out of the recession in the go-go days, right, Palo Alto is pretty far over on this side. This is actually 3 years, so it's a little bit distorted, right? But in the 3 years from 2014 to 2016, we added about a quarter million square feet of office and R&D space, and about 300 housing units, which puts us sort of out here in deficit land. But in 2016, we started putting office caps in place, and that had a fairly significant effect on the production of commercial office space. And so in 2017, we did about 35,000 square feet of office space, about just under 100 jobs, some of those being ADUs, right? And so we're pretty close to equilibrium. And if you look at where we are on the comp plan, right, the comp plan calls for moderate increases in housing production with the same limitations on commercial office space development. The comp plan puts us into the right side of this. It puts us as a sustainable development policy that doesn't dump, you know, hundreds or thousands of unmet housing needs onto the surrounding communities, Menlo Park, East Palo Alto, Mountain View, and so forth. And so what you have here, you could argue, I don't think it was intended this way, but it's sort of congealed this way. You could argue that there's, you know, a policy in here, right? Okay, I plan to come back to this later, okay? But for the moment, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about council priorities for 2019. So the council adopted 4 major priorities for 2019, okay? Doesn't mean we're not going to do other things, but these are areas we picked out for a special focus, right? Transportation, grade separation, very important this year, climate action, and long-term fiscal sustainability. And we're going to do something a little bit different this year, which is staff is actually developing work plans for each of these items, okay? And staff's going to come back within the next couple months with proposals and drafts for things to do here. And we haven't done that before, but we're going to do that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk a little bit about the highlights of this, because I want to move on and spend some time talking about regional and legislative issues, which this year I think have a significant potential to have impacts, either good or bad, right, on Palo Alto, and I think it's fairly important, so I think we ought to spend some time talking about that. But for the moment, let me talk first about transportation. And most people think about this as traffic. You know, I think it makes sense to think of kind of in-town traffic, of people moving around town, separately from commuter traffic, which is people coming in from out of town to work in the city, and in some cases people living in the city going out of town to jobs outside, because 2/3 of Palo Alto workers actually don't work in Palo Alto. Right. For in-town traffic, things like bike infrastructure, safe routes to school, you know, shuttles and so forth, particularly as the VTA tends to withdraw a little bit from the North County, you know, are things that make an impact there. You know, bike infrastructure probably doesn't have too much impact on people driving from San Jose to get here. There, the focus really has been on how do we reduce single occupancy vehicle travel, and a key effort of that, as I think a lot of people know, is we set up a couple of years ago what we call a Transportation Management Association, and they do things like buying Go Passes and subscriptions to carpooling services and things like that to try to get people out of single occupancy cars. And they've actually, it's pretty early, but they have had some success. At this point, it looks like, and it's difficult to measure, and it's one of the things that we need to do is you know, refine our measurements. But at this point, it looks like they're removing a few hundred car trips per day from inbound traffic. Now, if you look at, you know, our limits, our growth limits on office space, about 50 to 70,000 square feet a year, right, between the annual cap and the citywide cap. You know, depending on your yardstick, that probably produces somewhere between 500 and 1,000 car trips a day. And so what you have here is actually kind of interesting. The TMA and the associated efforts, right, are within striking distance of actually absorbing the increase in traffic every year. And that's a good thing, because it means we won't be making it worse. That said, if you look at the amount of traffic, existing traffic on major arterials, Alma, El Camino, it's many, many times larger than this. 30, 40,000 car trips a day, 500,000 citywide. And what it looks like is that, you know, we should set our expectations that SOV reduction efforts probably aren't going to make a deep impact on existing traffic until they're much, much larger. But they will help us stop making traffic worse, and that's important. Okay. Even existing traffic, there's stuff that we can do with. So this obviously is the well-known university afternoon outbound commute. As everybody knows, a fair amount of that actually goes through Crescent Park neighborhoods these days. We could take action to try to push traffic from the neighborhoods back onto the arterials, right? That's a policy decision, but it's one that I think, you know, we're going to want to look at as we start looking at transportation this year. Parking, I'm not going to say too much. I think that we have an effort to figure out, you know, exactly how much demand is there parking in residential. We have some good data on that. I think we could use some more. Grade separation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about grade separation, but the highlights are, we started out this process saying that you know, we need to look at the whole spectrum of alternatives and converge to one. And it looks like it's probably a little bit more complicated than that. There are differences between the crossings. And so it's still conceivable we could do a citywide tunnel, but the problem is that it's very, very expensive to do that, and it's not clear where the money's going to come from. If we don't do a citywide tunnel, then it makes sense we're going to look at the Meadow-Charleston area, the Churchill area, and the Alma-Palo Alto crossing kind of as different entities. Again, the challenge is the price tag on this is somewhere between, you know, $500 million to a few $1 billion. We are going to expect some money from Measure B in the $300 to $400 million range, so they're going to need some more money than that. You know, the issue is that we don't have any perfect options here. You know, every one of these things has warts, but we're going to have to pick one. And the issues that we're grappling with, of course, are, you know, what's going to happen on, what are the impacts of construction while it's going on? How is it going to impact traffic on surrounding streets? And of course, where's the money going to come from? Stanford GOP, Stanford's planning a very large expansion next door. Stanford is actually not part of, the university is not part of Palo Alto, it's part of the county. So the county is working with Stanford on the development agreements for that, and we're working with the county. What we are asking for is what we call full mitigation of adverse impacts. I mean, there's going to be quite a bit of potential to, you know, be noticeable as they densify here. Principally on the school district has some real exposure. Traffic and transportation, of course, several other areas. We're not asking Stanford to go build us a new cinema or something like that, but we are asking Stanford to fully mitigate the adverse impacts of their expansion on the surrounding communities. Climate change. I think, as everybody knows, that we've embarked on an ambitious goal to reduce our emissions. We've made a lot of progress on it. We're doing a lot of different things, but the bulk, the things that make the biggest difference is really a two-phase kind of thing. One, to decarbonize our electric utility, which we have done, right? So we're now at green electricity. That made a huge impact. It's going to get harder we're going to have to do a lot more smaller things than one big thing here going forward, but a lot of it is convert other energy uses to electricity. And if you look at where our emissions are right now, about 2/3 of our remaining emissions are in transportation, primarily cars, about 1/4 in natural gas, which is used for cooking, water heating, space heating, and other kinds of things that could be electric instead, and then a little bit of other stuff, right? And the biggest impact we're going to have on transportation, I suspect, is moving to electric vehicles, okay? And actually, we're doing a lot of EVs in Palo Alto. Roughly 1 out of every 3 cars registered in Palo Alto is now an EV, so it's really a significant number. And over time, that's going to take a big bite out of transportation. Now, one issue we have that is most people that have an EV charge them at home. Right? That's, if you got a single-family house, then it's relatively straightforward to get a charger. If you live in an apartment building, right, or a condo, it's much more complicated to get a charger in. And so 40% of Palo Altans, 40%, where'd I go? 40% of Palo Altans live in multi-unit buildings, and if we don't figure out a business model to get chargers into multi-unit buildings, then it's going to limit how much we can take out of this. Natural gas, we're doing things like giving rebates on water heaters, and staff is looking at green building codes to see about how we can do more encouragement of electrification of buildings. One thing that we are going to do this summer that is one of my personal things is it's in the miscellaneous area. We're going to throw the switch and decommission the sewage incinerator. Right now we burn our sewage, okay? Sometime this summer we're going to turn it off. We're going to dewater the sewage. We are going to transport it somewhere for composting, but nevertheless we're going to save about 15,000 metric tons a year of emissions, about a 3/4 reduction in emissions, right? So that'll be good. One other thing I'm not going to talk about is the city's looking at it. You're going to hear more about sort of mitigations for sea level rise, very long term kind of thing. So now I'm going to shift gears and I'm going to talk briefly about finances. For those of you who've seen my pension presentation before, hopefully this will be fast. Very briefly, this is our general fund. Our long-term revenue growth and expense growth is about the same. Okay, so that's been healthy. But over the last almost 20 years, you know, we have developed a very, very large unfunded public pension liability and health. At this point, we have Palo Alto's unfunded pension and medical liability is somewhere between $700 and $750 million. It's a very large amount of money. Of that, $500 or $600 million is pension, and the rest is medical. It turns out that Palo Alto, believe it or not, has the 8th largest per household unfunded public pension liability in the entire state of California. Okay? And the root cause is that is CalPERS unrealistic. I mean, there's a lot of causes, but the root one is CalPERS unrealistic investment return expectations. Again, you know, it's just like saving for college or something like that. If you're going to have a higher return, you don't have to save as much. And CalPERS said, we're going to have this much return, so we didn't save much. And this is true of every city, almost every city in California. They didn't hit those returns, but we still owe the money, and so that's where the debt comes from. How does that work for our day-to-day finances? Well, this is the general fund. About $210 million this year. About 2/3 of it is wages and benefits. Most of the rest is other kinds of expenses, a little bit is a transfer to infrastructure, but what I want to point out is this red wedge here. What this is the annual payment that CalPERS requires us to pay in order to go towards paying down the existing $500 or $600 million of debt. Now we have another kind of pension expense, which is the cost of our current pensions for current employees going forward, and that's out here in wages and benefits. This is just the mortgage to pay down the existing debt. Okay? It's about 8% of the general fund this year, about $17 million. But it turns out that this is the largest, or is the fastest growing major expense by far in our general fund. And so what's going to happen over the next several years is this slice, and there's not a lot we can do about it, this slice is going to grow and consume more and more of the general fund. And as it gets bigger, because it's growing so much faster, the overall expense growth is going to increase in Palo Alto. And so we have to grapple with that. The action that we have taken over the last couple of years, and a lot of work by the last couple city councils and staff on this, because this is easy to say, but very, very hard to do. In fact, I'm not aware of other cities in California doing this, with the possible exception of San Jose that got close, and they're not a CalPERS system, right? Is that we have gone and said, you know what? The problem is that if you're not assuming realistic investment return rates, then you're still not fully funding your future pensions because you're not saving enough money for the future ones, never mind the existing one, right? So what we said is we're going to have to do that. And so that, in fact, is what we did. We have recognized, for a variety of reasons, we think 6.2% is the right number. So we have shifted our city budgeting. This year is the first year, or this past year has been the first year. We're going to keep doing this. We're organizing our city budgeting around this number, 6.2%, which means our future pensions are fully funded. Okay? I don't think anybody in California does this. No school district in California does this. The school districts are even further underwater than most of the cities. That means we're going to have to optimize how we use our money. And you can see some of this going on right now. The aquatics and animal shelter contracts, for example, were able to actually increase services while saving money. You don't get a lot of opportunities to do that, but we got to be looking for them. We are looking at city operations, trying to glean efficiencies out of there. I know this is uncomfortable for a lot of the employees. I'm sorry about that. But the benefit of this is by going through this, your pensions are going to be fully funded, and they aren't today. Okay? A number of other things we're going to have to continue to prioritize. What things do we have to have versus not to have? We downscaled the bike bridge. We didn't buy the post office building, though we wanted to. So we're trying to be very, very careful about that. So what I would say is the following. Okay? Palo Alto budgets its operations assuming a 6.2% investment return on your pensions. What that means is that you, as an employee, if you come to work for us in Palo Alto, and send your resume to Ed because he is hiring big time, okay? If you come to work in Palo Alto, your pension will be fully funded, okay? Your pension will be secure. You go to any other city in the state, I don't know. So with that, Palo Alto I see is 2019. I really think this is a year of really buckling down and making progress on some of these initiatives that we've already been underway. We've done a lot of visionary initiatives in the last couple of years. Comp plans, master plans for Parks and Rec and the urban forest, infrastructure, the CalAV garage, the bike bridge, Fire Station 3 remodel. We're working on the Cubberley plan, the North Ventura plan. We're working on our financial plan. We got to make progress on these, and that's really, I think, this year is going to be a nuts and bolts year. I think this is a year that we focus on good government, delivering good services, good, high-quality, efficient services to residents, and being a good neighbor to the region. And the new city manager, Ed Shikata, has a bon mot that I really like, which is, there's some of the time you got to be a rock star, and the other time you got to be rock solid. Okay? This is a year for Palo Alto government to be rock solid. Okay. With that, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about regional stuff. There's stuff going on in the region that makes an impact on Palo Alto, And I think if regional things are going to make an impact on Palo Alto, then it's our responsibility to weigh in on helping the region make the right decisions too. I do want to put a disclaimer out here. If anybody has seen this, the Joint Venture Silicon Valley 2019 State of the Valley Index, this is a great document. They did an immense amount of work, and there's some really, really fascinating information in here. It's kind of for gear and data heads, right? But if you're interested in this stuff, I strongly recommend you take a look at it because there's some really thought-provoking stuff in here. Most of the data that I'm going to show from this point onward actually comes out of here, some from other places as well. So what's going on in the region? Well, there's a very large amount, or there's a substantial amount of new legislation this year coming in Sacramento that would override local city zoning. And the main focus is in order to try to boost housing growth, primarily market rate housing. There are a number of bills here. The most relevant one is one called SB 50, which is a component of a package called CASA, which is several other bills. What SB 50 was, it would look for areas that are defined as, near high-quality transit, job-rich environments, and places with good schools. And pretty much all of Palo Alto falls into this. And it would say, okay, municipalities no longer have complete control of zoning here. Actually, any project up to certain heights, which could be up to 75 feet or so, including bonuses, are required to be approved by law, by state law. Reduces or eliminates parking requirements depending on where you are in town. There are some other bills. There's part of Costa 50 that actually diverts part of future city property taxes if it passes, which is what we use to pay raises to our labor groups. So there are some others. Some of them are actually pretty out there. There's one that appears to ban citizen ballot initiatives on most zoning issues. Right? I don't even know if that's constitutional, but it's out there. So I'm going to show a couple of slides now that are probably going to provoke some reaction. It's not my intent to provoke reaction, but I think this is what it is, and people should be aware of it. And the truth is, some people are going to look at that and go, boy, I don't like that. Other people are going to look at it and go, yeah, that's what we ought to do. Okay? But we need to have a shared vision of at least what the reality is. And so, I do want to take one more step. In addition to, before I get to that, this is all the stuff in the legislature. In addition, the governor, in the first month of his new administration, Governor Newsom, called for what he called a Marshall Plan for housing, which was kind of separate from this. And he called for a major investment in housing, much larger than people are talking about over here, funded primarily from Sacramento, and he called for the tech companies to contribute. Right? And also, he called for fiscal sanctions for cities that don't achieve their housing targets. Primarily, we mentioned, was loss of transportation funding. So this is sort of on a separate track from all the legislative stuff. So that's the context. Here is what SB 50 would do in Palo Alto. First of all, it covers the entire city, applies to the entire city, more in some places than others. More in the downtown Professorville area, parts of Old Palo Alto, and Green Meadow. But it has some impacts everywhere. And these are some of the kind of things that this would make mandatory by state law. So this is what North California Avenue looks like right now, First Baptist Church. That's what it would look like, or that's what you could build a project by law under SB 50 in this area. Okay, this is Professorville, and that's under SB 50. A project like that would be required to be legal. This is, by the way, without the density bonuses. So this is the baseline, right? This is Eichler neighborhood in Green Meadow, and that's what it would look like with an SB 50. So again, I think this has the potential to arouse passion in people. I think it's important we just know what it is. Again, there are a sizable number of people in Palo Alto, and their perspective, is legitimate, that are gone. This is what we should do. We have some serious problems, and this is part of the answer. And there are other people that look at that and go, geez, I don't think that's a good idea. So that's the context. Now, what's the argument to do this? The argument to do this is as follows. Right? Since the recession, the Bay Area has added jobs 500% or 600% faster than housing units. Okay? And the result is we have a very large shortage of housing units relative to people that want to live in them. Okay? And the hypothesis is there is an artificial housing shortage caused by unnecessarily restrictive local city codes, okay, imposed by city councils and residents, right? In other words, it's a zoning problem. And if, in fact, you relaxed zoning, as these bills intend, SB 50 and CASA, right, that would unleash private developers to produce large increases in primarily market rate housing, but that in turn would trickle down to produce lower prices at all levels. And so that's the rationale behind doing this, okay? Also, that since cities have not moved on this, Sacramento really needs to step in and take control. And when you talk to folks like this about this stuff, there's also a smattering of, you know, this has gone on long enough, we need to do something, you know, we just need to try some stuff, right? There is also, and I would say this, I mean, this is just what it is, right? You know, anytime you're talking about land and zoning, there's money involved, and that means there's politics involved. And this area is not devoid of that. But whether you think this is a good idea, or whether you think you know, these kinds of things are a good idea or not, or it makes sense to ask the question, would this actually work? Okay? So here is what housing permitting looks like in Santa Clara County over the last 50 years. And it was somewhat higher in the 70s, okay? But in the last 40 years, housing permits in Santa Clara County have, you know, basically varied up and down between 5,000 and 10,000 housing units per year, right, over a period of decades. And it varies a little bit in booms and busts and so forth, but that's primarily where we have been. So if you wanted a 300% or 500% increase in housing production, this is kind of what it would look like out here, right? So not a lot of historical precedent for that, right? And you say, well, what would it take to actually get there, and would, you know, relaxing zoning in suburbs and other places, would it actually deliver this, right? And that's really the crux of the question, right? There are some people who think yes. There are a number of people who think no. You know, there's a different opinion, and by the way, I really recommend, if you want to know this, if you want to read about this stuff, I really recommend this book, Pictures of a Gone City, which I think a lot of people have read, right? It's by a guy named Richard Walker. You may or may not agree with his politics, but he has done an exhaustive amount of research on the Bay Area, and it's really a fascinating piece of information, a huge amount of research. You know, and he's one of the people that says, you know, actually we don't think it's a supply shortage, an artificial supply shortage. We think it's really caused by massive demand increases, especially high wage demand increases by the success of the valley, right? Another piece of kind of interesting perspective was the Santa Clara County Grand Jury did a study on affordable housing last year, and they said something interesting. They said the whole affordable housing problem could be solved for $30 billion in the South Bay, right? And yeah, that's a lot of money, right? And it's also kind of a hand wave. I mean, they said, well, what would it take to just go buy it all, right? You know, and they were looking at single-family houses too, as opposed to condos and so forth. But you know, maybe it's 30 billion, maybe it's 40, maybe it's 20. But the point is, you could attack it with a lot of money, right? Which, if you thought it was an economic problem and not a zoning problem, then you'd sort of gravitate toward this way. Okay. So, what if you really actually wanted to solve the problem? Okay. Well, the first thing you want to do, and I'm sorry, this is a busy one, and I think this is going to be my busiest slide. Right? You know, if you sort of got to define the problem, but it starts with the jobs housing thing. Since, as everybody knows, we've created jobs 6 times faster than new housing units, and so it's not a big stretch of thinking to say, well, if we're going to create one new dwelling for each 5 or 6 new workers, who's going to get the dwelling? Well, it's going to be the top 1/6 or 2/6, depending on how many people per unit of wage earners that get them, and the bottom 70% of earners are the ones who aren't going to get them, and so then they're going to get displaced to small spaces and long distances, and in fact, that is what we see, is a displacement of low and mid-wage earners to smaller spaces and farther distances away. One of the results is traffic, parking, and pollution congestion from people commuting from those distances, loss of socioeconomic diversity, in affluent areas. You know, it's hard to build affordable housing without a lot of money, right? And for the folks that are the farthest down, the consequences are even more severe. Uncertainty whether they're going to have a place to live in some cases even evictions, right? By the way, that's the new number each year of high-income households making over $150,000 a year, and you can see that there's quite a few of those, and those also outstrip housing production. So suppose you actually wanted $30 billion. I mean, it's a huge amount of money, although in consideration, you compare it to things like high-speed rail, for example, right? Or fortunately discontinued $20 billion for water diversion tunnels under the delta, right? It's on that order, right? And the question is, could you actually get it anywhere? And well, as I think as everybody knows, there's a lot of money in Silicon Valley, okay? 2016, 2017, the market capitalization of the top 150 companies in Silicon Valley increased $1.25 trillion with a T, okay, right? That's $1.25 trillion of new value in these 2 years. We've done really well, right? The top 150 companies in Silicon Valley, $900 billion in sales last year. Apple, Google, and Facebook each between the three of them have $387 billion in cash. These three actually, incidentally, also account for 3/4 of the tech job growth last year too, okay? And by the way, I want to be really, really clear, okay? At the get-go, I am not criticizing the tech companies. I do not for a minute think that what we ought to do is go out and ask Apple for $30 billion, okay? But I think we need to understand the dynamics of this if we're going to think about the problem the right way, okay? So if you look at this and you go, man, that's a lot of money. And at the same time, you've got basically all the symptoms we know about. It's a reasonable conjecture, okay, that if hypothesis A is that the problem is restrictive zoning in suburbs, okay, maybe hypothesis B is that the valley generates enormous wealth but doesn't invest enough of it in the housing and transportation infrastructure needed to support its job growth and its economic engine. And if that's the case, right, those costs, instead of being paid for, fall on communities, and disproportionately on those communities' lowest wage earners. Okay. Now, again, I believe the Silicon Valley economy has done an immense amount of good. We have created tens, hundreds of thousands of high-income households. Okay? We have lifted tens of thousands of households out of poverty. You look at this and go, this is the growth of households making $150,000 or more in San Mateo and Santa Clara counties over the last 10 or 12 years, right? This is the trend of mid and low wage households. This is what you want to see. More wealthy households, fewer low wage households. This is what you want to see, okay? That said, all is not roses even under the high-end households, okay? If your household makes $150,000 a year, you can actually afford an apartment in the Mid-Peninsula, even Palo Alto, okay? But one of the challenges you have is that a lot of these folks, they're really looking for a house. And you can't afford a house in Menlo Park or Palo Alto on only $150,000 income a year. And so a lot of these folks, for example, move to farther away, and they're part of the rush to Morgan Hill and places like that where they are building thousands of single-family homes, and then they're on 101 like everybody else, okay? Our problem, that's a slightly different problem than the one that most Palo Altans want us to focus on, which is middle and low wage earners. Okay, that's what we hear from. That's what we hear from most Palo Altans in government, right? And it varies a little by industry, right? The information technology industry is an astonishing, a huge percentage of information technology folks, the tech sector, are high wage households. If you go look at community infrastructure and services, which tends to be our provision as government, right? You have a much higher percentage of mid and low wage earners than high wage earners. I think as everybody knows, everybody in Palo Alto knows this, healthy communities need many kinds of people. We all know this. Everybody knows that 10% of our teachers actually live in town. Less than 10% of city staff lives in town. And there are people that we would like to have here who add value to the community just by being physically here. One of the hardest things one of the hardest positions to fill in the city staff is line workers and cable splicers. These are the folks that when the power goes out in the middle of the night in a rainstorm, got to go up the pole and fix it, right? You know, if they all live in Hayward, you know, it's going to be a wow, right? I mean, it's not even altruism. There's some enlightened self-interest in here as well, and everybody in Palo Alto knows it and sees it's a problem, right? I was talking to the head of one of our local nonprofits about 2 weeks ago. And he said, you know, obviously they have a trouble. They don't pay $150,000 a year, right? He said that they are actually thinking about, their board is actually considering buying a small apartment building to house their staff. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that Google does, okay? And here you are at about as far on the other end of the enterprise spectrum, and they're thinking about it too, right? The point is, there actually are solutions to these problems, but they cost. It takes money. Again, the main problem with affordable housing at any level, right, is who's going to pay for it, right? You need money for it. Well, what about the idea that, the trickle-down idea? That is that if we build a bunch of luxury housing, it's actually going to trickle down and help a lot of other people. I think there's immense skepticism to this idea. There's a lot of people believe it, but even some of the, you know, when Richard Florida is coming out, who's one of the most strident and passionate pro-urbanist, new urbanist kind of guys, comes out and says, well, you know, maybe actually it doesn't work that way. You got to think about it. It's not clear that that is going to actually work, right? So what you have today, in one view, right, is that the valley generates immense wealth, but it's very concentrated, and the costs, the housing and transportation costs to sustain that economic growth are not adequately funded. The costs are exported to the communities, and the result is the housing crisis and the flight of the middle and all the other things we know about, right? By the way, there's another issue. Even the information technology sector may not be immune from this kind of stuff. You know, there's an accelerating trend of people leaving the valley. This year, for the first year, more people left the valley than arrived, okay? People are still arriving, but guess what? The people that are arriving want to be paid more than the people leaving because of the cost of living here. The issue is, there's a really serious question. SB 50 and the current legislative measures, which focus on local control of zoning, right, don't really fix this process, okay? They don't do anything about the economics. They don't do anything about money, okay? What they do, arguably, if you believe this model, it's hard not to suspect that what they do is extend the existing process a few more turns of the wheel, okay? A little more market rate housing, a few more high wage employees, funded by, you know, a little more displacement, a little more cost on communities. So, there you have it. Two hypotheses on what the source of the problem in the valley is, okay? Now, the valley is a titan, okay? You know, the valley is the superhero of the world, right? Everybody, the economic engine of Silicon Valley is the envy of the known universe, okay? Many people have tried to duplicate it. Few have succeeded, right, if any. Hypothesis A, the titan can be brought down by local zoning in suburbs, okay? Hypothesis B, it can be brought down by underinvestment in some of its really core fundamental infrastructure, right? The history of industry in the West, it's very hard to find examples of industry titans who were brought down by city councils in suburbs. However, it is replete with titans, oops, getting ahead of myself here, replete with titans who are brought down by distraction on short-term results and slowness to invest in the core infrastructure that supports the foundation of their business. If you want to build autonomous vehicles, you must invest in artificial intelligence and advanced robotics. If you want to build 5 nanometer silicon, you must invest in advanced lithography. And if you want to maintain the world's most dynamic innovation economy on the planet. You must invest in the housing, the transportation, and the community infrastructure to support your talent. Okay, so I am one of the people who believes that if you're going to complain about somebody else's approach to solving a problem, it helps a lot if you got your own. Okay? So let's talk about that a little bit. If you buy hypothesis B, that it's an investment problem, let's take a look at how that works. So I'm going to go back to my chart here. This is the chart that I showed, talking about Palo Alto housing and commercial development, only scaled up to Silicon Valley. Okay? And Palo Alto, we're in this little dot down here. Okay. Now, what you have here is commercial development growth and housing growth for Silicon Valley. Coming out of the recession, okay, 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, the Valley continued to add, I'm sorry, this is probably hard to read in the back, but this is 2010 through 2014. The Valley continued to add housing units at about the same 5,000 to 10,000 rate that it had for the last 40 years. Okay? Very little new office development. Okay? On the other hand, jobs growth was very high. Right? So how did that work? Well, it turns out at that time there was actually a lot of spare capacity in the existing commercial space because there had been a recession. Right? And so it's reasonable to think that most of the new job growth went to the existing space, and it also densified, as everybody knows. There's, it's not just, there's a lot of places that aren't, 250 square feet per employee. Okay? But starting in 2015, coincident with drops in commercial vacancy rates, the Valley went on a massive tear, okay, of commercial development, okay, office space. So 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018. This is one city, 4 years in the Bay Area, right? And most of these, the whole Valley basically hit the accelerator on commercial office space production, which provided space for lots and lots of jobs, but there was no increase, as you see, in housing production. And therefore, the Valley ran up, each year, a large housing deficit for each one of these. And furthermore, the way this is run up, a big part of the way this run up was a very large number of projects. And here's a smattering of some, right? And there are a lot of individual development projects. Now, most of these are mixed, a lot of these are mixed-use developments. But invariably, the mixed-use developments that we do produce a lot more demand for housing than the actual housing that comes with them, right? So the projects also have a housing deficit, okay? The most extreme case is probably Santa Clara City Park here, which had a housing deficit of somewhere in the range of 16,000 homes, right? I mean, there's only 16,000 homes in Palo Alto, right? This is so extreme that the city of San Jose actually tried to sue him over it, right? And so the way you develop giant housing deficits is with a lot of projects that have housing deficits. Okay? Now I want to focus in on two of these, right? In particular. Almost all these projects had big housing deficits, except for only one that I can think of. Okay? That one. What that is the Mountain View North Bayshore Precise Plan, primarily between Mountain View and Google, although a couple of other tenants as well. This project, this plan, and it's not done, they're still hammering out the development agreements and so forth that go into it, but the plan is 3.5 million square feet of new commercial space and just under 10,000 housing units. Okay? So it will produce around 14,000 jobs. And 10,000 housing units is enough, depending on whether it's 1.5 workers or 1 3/4 and so forth per, to house 14, 15, 16,000 employees, workers. In other words, it's essentially a jobs housing parity. What that means is that this project produces some good jobs and does not produce a deficit in terms of housing, doesn't add to the regional housing shortage, doesn't make the problem any worse. Okay? Also provides, there's some other things, provides some transportation funding. Mountain View's going to run shuttles up and down and so forth. Right? Now let me talk for a second about another well-known project in the Bay Area, which is the Valco SB 35 plan. Okay, now there are a couple of competing plans floating around for this one. They're pretty similar. This is the one that's mandated under state law, SB 35. 2.4 million square feet of office and retail plus 2,400 housing units. So it's going to produce, you know, at capacity, it's going to produce maybe 9,000 or so jobs in the ballpark. This much housing can support 4,000, 4,500 employees. Okay? So a reasonable question is, if you're going to add 9,000 employees and provide housing for 4,000 or 5,000, right, where are the other 4,000 or 5,000 going to live? Okay? And the answer is, either they're going to live in Morgan Hill, or they're going to live nearby, and the people they displace are going to move to Morgan Hill. Okay? This project has a housing deficit of 2,000 or 3,000 units. Those costs are exported onto the community. Okay? The electorate of Cupertino referended this project. Okay? And you can sort of see why. You know? It's hard to argue that this is a really good project for Cupertino. Okay? There are some people who do well with it, but you know, that's economics, right? So I want to point out, this project was produced by a lot of hard work by the local Mountain View City Council working together with the private sector. This project was created by a state mandate from Sacramento. Okay, this is required to be legal. Even the referendum legally can be overturned, can probably be overturned in court because it's state law. Right? It was created by state law, SB 35, which, by the way, are the same. The folks that created SB 35 a couple years ago are actually the same folks that are behind SB 50 and some of these other laws. Okay? This one is sustainable. That one is not. So, if you are a person who believes that the right way to solve the region's housing crisis is to turn control over to Sacramento, then this case provides a counterexample. Now, there's something else that comes out of this which is actually kind of interesting, which is, what does this mean for government policy? Well, if every city were like the North Bayshore Precise Plan and lay on this line, whether they were up here or in the middle, but if every city were on this line, or they were in subregions who agreed that the total subregion would be on this line, then we would work our way out of our housing crunch. So what should governments do? Well, again, this is one model, okay? If you buy this model, then the answer is basically money and geography, okay? Again, you have to buy the model that's an investment problem, right? And that the solution is, the money side is ongoing investment, increased investment in the housing and transportation infrastructure needed to support the valleys, needed to sustain the valley's health, right? And it should come from the sources of wealth, right, created in the valley ought to be reinvesting in housing and transportation. The interesting thing is cities are already innovating in this area, okay? Mountain View, East Palo Alto, and San Francisco have all levied, you know, various kinds of headcount taxes and related in order to fund housing and transportation. There's discussion going on in Palo Alto right now about a business tax in 2020 to fund primarily transportation, but potentially possibly housing as well, right, or other things. That fits into this umbrella. You know what fits into this umbrella? Raising the impact fees on commercial growth for affordable housing fits under this umbrella, okay? It also makes sense, the state might want to put some money into this, okay? If the engine of Silicon Valley, the superhero economy, is so important to the state of California and the nation as a whole, it might make sense for the state to invest. Guess what? That sounds a lot like the governor's Marshall Plan that he proposed in January. Okay. Now, which I think is a heck of a good idea, and I hope it goes someplace. Now, I think there's another aspect we haven't talked about very much, although it's kind of interesting. It came out in the Santa Clara grand jury, the 30 billion, they said, well, if you put it farther south, farther away, it would actually be substantially less than that, right? Now, geography matters. And I think if you take the view that this is about investment, and you start thinking about how can I maximize the value of my investment, you got to start looking at geography, because the costs of housing and transportation in the Bay Area vary considerably, right, depending on where you are. In particular, they are much higher in the Mid-Peninsula than they are, for example, in San Jose. Okay? Well, guess what? The private sector has figured this out and is already innovating. The Google-led land rush to Diridon Station, this is why. Okay? A place where there's good transportation infrastructure because they got BART and light rail. That's where VTA is still concentrated. Okay? They have much lower cost housing and a big workforce that actually leaves during the daytime. Right? You know, in my opinion, Google did two things. One very, very smart and the other brilliant. Okay? The smart one was recognizing that the high ROI expansion made sense at Diridon Station. The brilliant one was going down there first and locking up all the best land before everybody else figured it out, but they're on the way too, right? Okay, the other thing about geography that's important is if you buy the view that job growth is the real driver, that's what drives the economy, that's what drives the demand, and so forth, then you'd say, you know, maybe it makes sense to focus the housing and transportation investments, especially if there's mandates and state and government encouragement, as close as possible to the job growth, okay? If you believe that, then the idea that you should mandate new housing in good school districts in Los Altos for workers who are going to be 25 miles away in Diridon Station, that's a very hard argument to justify. Okay? When the governor called for fiscal disincentives to cities, taking away transportation funding from cities that didn't meet their housing targets. You know, depending on how you look at that, I mean, you can say, okay, they're going to take money, they're going to cut transportation funding for cities that don't meet housing targets. Well, presumably that means give it to cities that do meet, you know, do expand housing, you know. That actually makes a lot of sense to me, okay? I think the governor's plan is a really good idea, as says, or has a lot of potential, and I think done right, it would get a lot of support from cities, right? Okay, now there's one other thing that I think we need to do, and this is what Sacramento really should regulate, okay? Not setbacks, okay? In order for this to work, you want people to be on the good line, okay? The bad behavior, the behavior you don't want, is cities that approve big commercial development projects, okay, that produce thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs, okay? Negotiate development agreements that provide money to the city, which they spend on city amenities, and then dump the housing and transportation expense on the next city down the peninsula, okay? People shouldn't be allowed to do that. Cities shouldn't be allowed to do that. That's what the government should regulate, okay? That's what Sacramento should regulate. I mean, look, this is a lot of charts and arrows. It's really simple, okay? Add a job, you got to add a house. Maybe it's 2 jobs, you got to add a house. Add 1,000 houses, you got to add a school, okay? Add 2,000 houses, you got to add a park, okay? That's the principle here, okay? Okay. Palo Alto 2019 is a year of opportunity. We have some challenges, both external, grade separation, regional pressures, got to get full mitigation in the Stanford GOP, right? We have some things to look forward to. It's our 125th birthday, and we have a number of good initiatives, and if we make progress on those initiatives and some wise choices that will serve our future well, then we will stay a healthy city, a healthy community, a good neighbor, and if we do it right, God willing, a healthy region. Thank you very much. Thanks, Jeremy. Jeez. Everybody's still awake. Okay, that's good. With that, that's the end of the formal program. We still have food. There will be reception and drink here. Thank you all very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of the evening. Much appreciated.